Good day. Last 24 hours have witnessed further developments in the Ukraine war and also much speculation as to what the future policies of a potential Trump administration will be. The last 24 hours have also suggested a certain stepping up in diplomatic activity, but also growing resistance from some people in Ukraine to any suggestion that Ukraine should indeed, in any form, fall back, compromise on its maximalist objectives to bring all of its territory, all the territory it acquired when it became independent in 1991, back under its control. Anyway, let's start with the military situation, and I'm going to this time be as brief as I can be in discussing the military situation in Ukraine. As I said in a recent video, this is a very, very long front line, discussing everything that happens across this front line in the kind of detail that perhaps that might require would take an inordinate amount of time, and I'm not going to do so this time. I'm going to focus specifically on the three most important areas, which are which are the areas west of Ocheretino and towards Pokrovsk, where there's been significant things taking place, and also Toretsk, where there is a major collapse. But also I'm going to say something about the situation and in southern Ukraine, in the southern part of the front lines, where events are also taking a very important and dramatic turn. I'm going to say a little more afterwards about the situation in Chasiv Yar. But let's start with the situation in what might be described as the Kurachovo Vuhledar theatre of the battle lines. Firstly, we now have apparently film evidence which confirms that the Russian soldiers have indeed entered the village of Konstantinovka in southern Donetsk region. This is the village defended by the 79th Brigade, which lies to the west of Novomikhailivka, which the Russians captured some months ago, and Paraskovyevka, which they captured shortly after, and which lies astride the main supply road to Vuhledar, a road which Ukrainian sources themselves, including the 79th Brigade, confirm that the Russians have now cut and have entrenched themselves on. Now, a couple of days ago, the 79th Brigade reported that there'd been a massive Russian missile, bomb and artillery strike on Ukrainian positions in Konstantinovka, that they'd suffered heavy losses, dozens of men killed and wounded over the course of this strike, that their communications with the outskirts, the eastern outskirts of Konstantinovka had broken down, and there was speculation discussed at length, as I remember, on the Military Summary channel, but also other places, Slavyangrad, Intel Slava, other places like this, that there would be a Russian advance towards Konstantinovka, an actual Russian assault on Konstantinovka itself. And sure enough, a few hours later, the Ukrainians published film of a large movement of Russian armored vehicles, which they said was taking place in the Kurachovo area, but which, of course, could ultimately be localized in Konstantinovka itself. And the Ukrainians provided lots of film and pictures of bombs and explosions around these armoured vehicles and attempted to pass off this armoured assault on Konstantinovka as a failure, and quite a large part of the media in the West went along with that, as it always does. I expressed some skepticism about this, as I have done in the past, and in any event, we now have confirmation that the assault did in fact deliver the Russian troops to Konstantinovka, and that they have now entered this large village. And fighting is going on inside Konstantinovka, which, by the way, from the pictures, is essentially a ruin. But it is impossible for me to say at the moment how much of Konstantinovka the Russians control, whether they control just a small part of it, few buildings maybe on the outskirts, or whether they have advanced more deeply inside Konstantinovka, whether they've reached the central part of Konstantinovka. As I said, it's impossible for me to say how severe the fighting in Konstantinovka actually is. For the record, my guess is that the Russians have enlarged their foothold. They probably occupy more than just a few buildings, but I don't think they've yet reached the central part of this village. In this very same area, when there was the fighting for Novomikhailovka, the 79th Brigade put up an intense resistance, but and it took the Russians, as I remember, several months before they were able to clear Novomikhailovka. I think this time the 79th Brigade is not as strong as it was then. The supply lines to the Ukrainian forces are not as strong as they were during the Battle of Novomikhailovka, and I suspect that Russian progress in Konstantinovka will be a great deal faster, but still, I suspect we're talking about several weeks of intense fighting before the Russians are likely to gain control, full control of this village. Anyway, there we are. The Russians are in Konstantinovka. Fighting is underway. The battle has begun. We'll see where it goes. Now, further north, the Battle of Krasnogorovka does indeed appear to be close to its final end. All kinds of mapping projects have provided maps about what the situation in Krasnogorovka is. A couple of days ago, I think it was about 2 days ago, there were reports that the entire town had fallen completely under Russian control. That clearly is still not yet quite the case. There were other reports that the Ukrainian troops inside Krasnogorovka had become trapped and encircled. That is, of course, possible. I'm not going to say, based on the information that I've seen, whether or not that really is the case. But now, every mapping project that I've seen concludes the same thing, that the Ukrainians now do just control a few buildings in the northwestern part of Krasnogorovka. The northwestern tip of Krasnogorovka, if you like. Though, of course, there is still an important battle to undertake in order to clear this road that leads from Krasnogorovka westwards, with various buildings on each side. And this road is apparently considered a part of the town of Krasnogorovka itself. So it'll be some time before this area is also captured by the Russians, and we should not therefore expect an announcement from the Russian Defense Ministry that the town has been fully captured by the Russians for some time. But it does look as if the core area of Krasnogorovka, the Ukrainians, who have, in my opinion, again, over-invested in the defense of this town, suffering inordinate losses in doing so, well, it looks to me as if just a few 100 meters of territory are all that's left before the Russians take control. Now, I'm not going to discuss the situation around Krasnogorovka or Kurakovo further in this program, but I will say that we now have had increasing dramatic and, from the Ukrainian point of view, concerning information about the situation west of Ocheretino in what might be described generally as the Pokrovsk area. Now, there was a lot of reports a couple of days ago, mainly from the Ukrainians, that 2 battalions of Ukrainian troops had been encircled by the Russians in a cauldron between the villages of Lozovatska and Progress. And then there were reports that appeared yesterday that these troops had taken the decision into their own hands and had withdrawn from the area around Lozovatska and Progress, disobeying orders from the Ukrainian command, and had fled towards the village of Ivanivka. And several people pointed out that there was a scarcity of Russian reports about what had actually happened. My point yesterday, which I still hold to, by the way, is that whatever view you take about the supposed success of the Ukrainian troops in fleeing from this area, the fact was that they did flee and that they did do so without orders. And that, for me, is the single most important fact about this particular event. Anyway, we've now had a few more Russian accounts. We're now starting to get Russian accounts of what exactly did in fact happen in this area. Redovka, which is the Russian newspaper based in Smolensk, which strongly supports the special military operation, they've given their account. And they say that the claim that 2 whole battalions of Ukrainian troops was encircled between Lozovatska and Progress is wildly exaggerated. There simply isn't enough territory in this small area for there to have been that many troops, 2 battalions worth of troops located there. And Redovka says that we're talking about a force of 1.5 companies in strength, which would mean about 150 men. And I think this is about right, by the way. The Redovka also says that the field commanders of these Ukrainian troops were all killed in the fighting, which is why the Ukrainian troops who found themselves trapped between Lozovatska and Progress were basically leaderless and didn't know what to do, and why they were radioing back to their command headquarters, pleading for permission to retreat, which they weren't getting. And Redovka also says that this area was never fully surrounded by the Russians, that it would have made no logical sense for the Russians to try to attempt an entire encirclement operation in this area. It would have slowed down the tempo of Russian operations. And basically, what has happened, reading a little bit between the lines of the Redovka account, is that the Ukrainian troops, deciding to flee from their positions, made a heroic narrative out of it by describing themselves as having been encircled when they weren't, and heroically choosing to disobey orders and to preserve themselves, whereas in fact all that actually happened was that they fled. Well, everybody must be wary of confirmation bias, And as I've said, I'd already, before reading this report in Redovka, myself taken the view that the big story here was that a group of Ukrainian soldiers had disobeyed orders and fled. And it seems to me that that probably is what happened. And even allowing for confirmation bias, I think that the Redovka account is probably the correct one. This incident has been given a huge amount of attention in the media, in the West as well. As David Axe has written 2 whole articles about this for Forbes. It's a minor event, in my opinion, a wrinkle, if you like, in the overall battle. I think that too much attention is being given to it. Anyway, let's say what exactly is happening here, which is dramatic enough, because it looks as if the Russians have indeed now captured in full the Novoselivka Persha, Yevgenivka, Progress, all of these places. And they are indeed apparently closing in on the village of Sokol and the village, on the village of Veselia, and the village of Ivanivka. And they seem to be advancing down the railway lines. There's apparently a small railway line in this area, basically from Progress to the village of Zelanye. And they're clearing all the Ukrainian positions to the east of this railway as well, which will, by the way, open the way for an attack on Zelanye by the Russian troops who have now captured Novoselivka Persha. And the point is that the collapse of Ukrainian positions in this area is continuing and is accelerating. The Russians are not only able to capture villages, but they're able to advance rapidly beyond these villages, suggesting, by the way, that their own losses in these operations must be relatively light and that they have also established stable supply lines. Anyway, the Russians are able to advance rapidly from the villages that they capture. They're trundling, as I said, towards Zelanye along the railways. They've apparently already reached this village of Veselia, and there are reports that Russian troops have actually already entered this village, and they are close, very close to the village of Ivanivka. And as I've said previously, as I said in my program yesterday, if the Russians capture Ivanivka, then they are within a relatively short distance of the much more important town of Grodivka, which is on the road, the main road to Mirnograd and Pokrovsk, and which is, by the way, relatively close to Mirnograd and Pokrovsk. The Russians, as I said, moving rapidly and fast in this direction. And Ukrainian resistance is very disorganized. And in fact, there was an article, the article that I discussed at Redovka went into this in some detail, about the fact that there are various Ukrainian brigades supposedly operating in this area, but none of them seem to be particularly well managed, and there doesn't seem to be very much coordination or organization on the part of the Ukrainian troops. In the absence of clear fortified lines, they don't seem to be able to hold their positions for very long. And as we've seen with the episode between Progress and Lozovatska, Ukrainian troops have an increasing tendency now to retreat against orders in the face of Russian advances. Now, there was a very interesting discussion, I think it was on Slavyangrad, about the condition of the core Ukrainian brigade, which is providing the main part of the defense in this specific area, in this area towards east of Pokrovsk. And of course, we're talking about the 47th Mechanized Brigade, a brigade which has been spoken of as one of the most elite brigades of the Ukrainian army. And this report did a breakdown of reported losses of this brigade since it was first launched into battle in June last year, that's to say just over a year ago, as the spearhead in Ukraine's summer 2023 offensive. And the report, this discussion, which is a Russian discussion, a fact which must be emphasized, this discussion said that if one adds up all the casualties that the 47th Brigade has suffered from the various battles it has been engaged in, then these come to something like 11,000. 11,000 men dead and wounded. Now, the brigade itself, apparently when it was formed, numbered around 4,000 men. So it has suffered casualties that are around 3 times its original complement of troops. Now, the point that this report made is that the brigade, as it exists today, is in effect a shadow of the force that it was back in June 2023. It probably still gets the pick of whatever mobilization process is still taking place. It is taking place in Ukraine. It's probably also being replenished by veteran soldiers who have been wounded in other battles, in various battles, but who've been restored to battle fitness. Many of them perhaps have not previously served in this brigade, but one way or the other, the brigade itself and its cadre of officers and non-commissioned officers is now heavily diluted. And the report also made the point that the way the brigade is being used is becoming, well, they described it as illogical, but is violating doctrine in the sense that the brigade consists of 3 battalions, 3 maneuver battalions. The logical thing would be to have 2 battalions fighting, 1 battalion resting, and to rotate them. In fact, at any one point in time, all 3 battalions are fighting, so that the brigade is being burnt up continuously. It's lost around 14. It has conclusively lost, beyond repair or rehabilitation, 14 of its 31 Abrams tanks, and it has been forced back. It had previously been sent to defend Ukrainian positions in the villages of Sportwear and BITCHUTE, north of Avdiivka. All that fighting seems such a long time ago now. It failed in its effort to do that. Sportwear and BITCHUTE have long since now passed under Russian control, as is Avdiivka itself, and it is now fighting 20 kilometers to the west of the original positions it was sent to defend in this area. So a weakened, much weakened, very demoralized brigade, according to this report. And the Redovka report that I said previously basically took the view that the Ukrainian defense lines in this area have indeed effectively collapsed, that the Russians are able to advance basically at will. And if this is true, no reason to assume that it is not, then the Russians will probably eventually reach Mirnograd and Pokrovsk, and it will be then, but not before, that they finally slow down. Anyway, we shall see. There's other news from this part of the battlefront as well. The Russians are now apparently advancing west of Yasnobrodovka, that they also captured some days ago. Fighting continues along the road up as the Russians push up through the village of Karlovka further south. My own view about the fighting in Karlovka now is that if the Russians capture Zhelanye, then the Ukrainians very soon are going to have to abandon Karlovka, because the Russians will soon be in a position to cut the main supply road to Karlovka from Pokrovsk. Two supply roads from Pokrovsk are likely to be cut fairly soon. The one in the north from Pokrovsk to Konstantinovka and Chasov Yar, which will be cut when the Russians decide to storm Vozdvizhenka, and the other supply road, less important supply road, from Pokrovsk southwards towards Karlovka, but also probably to some extent towards places like Selidovo and Kurakhovo as well. Anyway, very interesting events taking place on this battlefront, very fluid battle. And we can see that the Russian advance in this area west of Ocheretino is in no sense slowing down. There is complex fighting taking place for different villages, but the Russians seem to be pushing relentlessly westwards, and there is no sign that the Ukrainians can resist them. Well, this is all very dramatic news, but even more dramatic is the news that continues to come from Toretsk. And as I said in my last program, I find it very difficult to understand in so many ways why Ukrainian resistance in Toretsk has been so much weaker than one might have expected at this stage in the war. Compared with the bitter fighting that has taken place when the Russians have reached other fortified towns, it's as if the Russians are able to advance again in the Toretsk area practically at will. Now, there's little information about the fighting in New York, which is the village to the southwest of Toretsk, but there continues to be dramatic information about the fighting in Pivchinya and Zaliznya. It does indeed now seem definitely as if Zaliznya has come completely, entirely under Russian control. And it's been suggested that the fighting is now going to be focused on capturing the building of an agricultural college, which is located in open fields. What looked to me from the maps to be open fields between Pivnichye and Zaliznya, and this agricultural college is the last important series of buildings before the Russians reach Toretsk itself, the actual urban center of Toretsk. And I've already said that I've said in previous videos that the Russians look like they're pushing westwards from New York to capture the various villages, Alexandropil and all of the others. And that does indeed look as if it is indeed the Russian plan. But just to say, even if these villages are captured, Alexandropil, Pantelimonivka, Balta, all of them located to the east of the H20 highway. Of course, the Russians now control Novokalinova, Keramik, and Arkhangelskoye, west of that highway. But if the Russians are able to capture these three villages, and if their advance from Zelanye continues in the way that it appears to be doing, well, we're going to be looking at a cauldron starting to form in the general Toretsk area, at least a cauldron taking in any Ukrainian defenders who continue to hold out between New York and the Russian positions in Peshanye and Zalizny, and potentially an entire cauldron, including one affecting Toretsk itself. I mean, this will be an absolute disaster. It will be the biggest encirclement operation that the Russians will have achieved in the battle, in the whole period of the special military operation. It will be a much bigger encirclement operation than the one they achieved in Mariupol, for example, back in 2022. And I have to say, I doubt that the Ukrainians themselves are going to do that. So, with all of these events playing out, I wonder whether perhaps the battle for Toretsk is also likely to end much more quickly than might have been imagined just a few weeks ago. I remember when the fighting in Toretsk first began, like many people, I thought it was a diversionary exercise or a raid or even a case of misreporting. I'd never imagined that Ukrainian defences in this area would collapse as quickly as they have. But it looks as if they not only have done so, but that they're collapsing in the most disastrous imaginable way. Well, there's other things going on in other parts of the battlefronts. We've had much less news over the last 24 hours from the northern area, from Volchansk, for example, from Kharkiv region. There's been reports of further advances in the Kupiansk area. In fact, the Russians themselves have told us a little about the fighting in Kupiansk area. This comes from our old friend Vitaly Ganshev, who is the head of the Russian civilian administration in the parts of Kharkiv region that the Russians control. And he's reported by TASS as saying, in general, I can say that our troops are moving quite steadily, but are moving quite slowly, but steadily towards Kupiansk and liberating the road linking Kupiansk and Svatovo. Our troops have placed several communities along the road under their control. As our troops advance, we will, of course, also move forward with our administration, study the situation, and render support where possible, in particular for the evacuation of civilians. So that's what Ganshev says. He seems confident that the Russians are indeed advancing in Kupiansk, and all of the reports say as much. And some of the mapping projects, especially since the fall of Makeyevka, or at least eastern Makeyevka, east of the Zherebets River, and also, as I remember, the village of Peshanye. By the way, just to say, there are apparently two villages called Peshanye in Kharkiv region, just to create confusion, just to warn people in advance about this. Anyway, since the fall of Peshanye and Makeyevka, it does seem as if the Russians are now well positioned to launch an attack on Kupiansk from the south, and they apparently are bombing Liman now very, very heavily, which suggests that they're also planning an advance across the Zherebets River to recapture Liman as well. And that's probably going to happen at some point in the next month or so. And there's been few reports from from Siversk, and none at all from Chasiv Yar. Though, as I have said many times, the fact that we're not getting reports from Chasiv Yar is not a sign that there is no fighting going on there. On the contrary, it probably is a sign that fighting is extremely intense and that the Russians are actually making progress. We will probably, at some point in the next couple of days or maybe a week or so, get a sudden report which puts the Russians far further, deeper inside Chasiv Yar than anybody had expected them to be. So a very, very difficult situation for the Ukrainians overall. As I've been saying for many weeks, the situation for the Ukrainians on the front lines is getting worse and worse with every single passing day. And this perhaps explains some of the very strange and contradictory messages that are coming out from Kiev. Sofia Midkiff put it to me very well a couple of days ago in a conversation which I had with her, that the Ukrainians have intellectually understood that they're going to lose the war, but emotionally they are unable to face it, and it looks as if they are therefore acting in increasingly contradictory and bewildering ways. And one also gets the sense that various agencies in the Ukrainian government are starting to act independently of each other. Now, we've had a very, very interesting report from the US media, which begs many questions about what has actually been happening. Now, this is actually a report from the New York Times, and it relates to the conversation between the Russian Defense Minister Andrei Belousov and US Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin, which took place on the 12th of July. Now, when I discussed that conversation shortly after it had happened, I made a point that the conversation was most unusual in that it had been initiated by the Russians, not by the Americans. In nearly every instance that I can remember over the period of the special military operation, and even before, when the Russian and American defense ministers have spoken to each other, or indeed when the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff of the United States has sought to speak to the chief of the General Staff of the Russian military, it is the United States that initiates the call. This time, most unusually, it was the Russians who initiated the call. And I speculated that the Russians were giving the Americans some kind of a warning, and that this was connected with some of the ideas that had been floating around about the Ukrainians conducting missile strikes inside Russia, and about the American positioning of missile forces in Germany, which, by the way, opinion polls now starting to show is extremely unpopular in Germany. Well, the New York Times has now provided some information about this call, which I suspect is correct, and it is very interesting. Now, first of all, they confirm that the Russians made the call in order to give the Americans a warning. But is slightly different, or rather different, from the kind of warning that I thought the Russians might be giving. It seems that the Russians told the Americans that the Ukrainians were planning some major operation within Russian territory itself. And the Russians, who seem to have complete knowledge about this operation, contacted the Americans and asked the Americans straight out, we know that the Ukrainians are planning this. Are you involved? With the implication that if the Americans were involved, the Russians would respond in some way. Well, the New York Times says that the Americans were shocked, that they were not aware at all of this purported Ukrainian operation, that they, however, took the Russian warning seriously enough to contact the Ukrainians and say, if you are thinking about doing something like this, don't. And that's basically all we're told, other than the fact that the Ukrainian leadership from time to time does all kinds of things that it has not first cleared with the United States and that the Americans are unhappy about, but that the Ukrainians pay no attention when the Americans tell them, under no circumstances, do things like this. Well, this is a most interesting story. It suggests that the Russians, by the way, have a great deal of information about what the Ukrainians are up to, and that they've now managed to penetrate fairly effectively the secret councils, apparently the very secret councils of the Ukrainians, and perhaps Kirill Budanov's organization, which presumably were the masterminds behind whatever this operation was. It also suggests that whatever information the Russians gave the Americans about this operation, the Americans found entirely convincing and completely believed, and that they then immediately assured the Russians they had nothing to do with this and told the Ukrainians to call it off. Whether, of course, the Americans really were as ignorant of whatever it was that the Ukrainians were planning, as the New York Times tells us, I have no idea. It could be, again, that the Americans, what shocked the Americans was not that the Ukrainians were planning to do whatever it was that they were in fact planning to do. Rather, it was that the Russians found out about it. That might have been what really shocked the Americans. I mean, I don't know, and I'm not going to speculate one way or the other. But it does suggest that something pretty wild and extreme was being discussed, in Kiev at least, and that the Ukrainians were thinking about doing it. Now, I'm not going to speculate as to what that was, but I would make a point that over the last couple of days, over the course of the last couple of days, Kirill Budanov himself has said that the Ukrainians have already attempted several assassination attempts on Vladimir Putin, that none of those assassination attempts so far have succeeded, and one wonders whether this extreme, wild operation that the Ukrainians might have been planning might have been connected in some way with that, thereby explaining this rather odd admission from Budanov himself. Again, let me stress, I am speculating here. I don't know whether that is the case or not. I'm putting together 2 and 2, and I might be making 10 instead of 4. I don't know. But anyway, Bogdanov did say those things, and those things were being said around the time, as I remember, when Belousov was talking to Austin, and the Americans were becoming deeply alarmed about something that the Ukrainians were supposedly about to do, and about the fact that the Russians were warning them of it. The key takeaway from this is that whatever it was that the Ukrainians were planning, and I want to stress again, I don't know what it was something that was deeply concerning, very alarming, concerning enough for the Russians to have contacted the Americans about it, concerning enough for the Americans to have been alarmed about it as well, and to come down on the Ukrainians and to tell them, don't even think of doing it. And the fact that the Ukrainians were plotting or planning something like that, to my mind, is a further illustration of how extremely desperate by this point in the conflict they have become. That they were planning something of this nature suggests, or something of such an alarming nature as to provoke a conversation between Belousov and Austin. Well, it does suggest that something, as I said, very extreme and very wild was being planned, and people tend to do that sort of thing, in my experience, when they are desperate. And I've already discussed how in recent days the Ukrainians themselves seem to have been reaching out, first to the Vatican and then to China. They sent Dmytro Kuleba all the way to Beijing to talk to the Chinese. I'm starting to get the sense, by the way, that that meeting in China, in Beijing, didn't go well at all. That the Chinese found that though the Ukrainians came talking peace, they were not really coming up with any kind of proposals that the Chinese found workable, and that the Chinese, rather like the Vatican official, rather like Viktor Orban a short time before, gave the Ukrainians a short lecture, basically telling them, look, you've got to be more realistic. You've got to stop thinking in this fantastic way about returning to your frontiers or just freezing the conflict. You've got to be more practical and more realistic about your situation. And that the Ukrainians didn't like hearing any of that. Now, we've had, perhaps in response to all of this, an angry reaction from Ukraine, and it's come from Mikhailo Podolyak, who is one of Zelensky's advisors and one of his key advisors. He has come back and angrily refuted all suggestions that Ukraine is prepared to compromise at all. He said that any agreement with the Russians that leads to the Russians still in control of Russian territory will not lead to an end of the Russian conflict. Such an agreement can be a freeze of the conflict for a certain time, but this only means that the Russians will work on their mistakes and update their own army. I'm paraphrasing what he said in an interview to the Associated Press. And apparently Kuleba said that this is not the time for negotiations. A negotiation process on fair terms must take place, but Ukraine needs to be in a position of strength, which then begs the question of why the Ukrainians sent Kuleba to Beijing at all. Well, the next person to try, apparently, and this must correlate in some ways to his recent visit to Moscow. The next person to try is Prime Minister Modi of India. Now, Modi, in his very first foreign trip, after his re-election as Prime Minister of India, went to Moscow and had a meeting there, a very lengthy summit meeting with President Putin. It was a very, very friendly meeting. All kinds of agreements were signed between the Russians and the Indians. In fact, the two countries charted a way forward. But now there are reports that at some point in August, Modi is intending to go to Ukraine, to Kiev, and there are reports that Modi is going to offer India's good offices as an impartial mediator between the Russians and the Ukrainians. Now, I've speculated about this possibility before. About a year ago, there was Glenn Deason and I interviewed a former Indian ambassador to Moscow, and I actually floated with the ambassador the possibility that India might at some point come forward and act as a mediator between the Ukrainians and the Russians. And I noticed that the ambassador did not reject that possibility. He said that the time for that was not then, but it could be that the time for it is now. Now, bear in mind that Modi has just been to Moscow. He's had discussions with Putin. Almost certainly he floated any mediation proposal, any proposal that the Indians offer their good offices as a mediator to the Russians. The Russians almost certainly would have agreed. And I'm going to explain what a mediator is supposed to do shortly. But anyway, I suspect that that was what the Russians agreed. The Ukrainians were absolutely furious about Modi's trip to Moscow. Zelensky made comments that were incredibly insulting and offensive of Modi, even as Modi was in Moscow. The Indians were angry and called in the Ukrainian ambassador in Delhi and handed the ambassador a protest note. But anyway, things have been sorted out since then, and now Modi is going to Kiev, apparently and specifically with the purpose of trying to get Zelensky, trying to talk sense to Zelensky, and to try to get him to agree to accept the good offices of the Indians as a potential, as mediators. Now, the key thing to understand about mediation, and by the way, the Indian media is specifically referring to India proposing itself as a potential mediator. The key thing to understand about mediation, and I have myself acted as a mediator in disputes, so this is something I have some experience of. And of course, these are legal disputes, but I don't think it is any different in terms of diplomacy, is that mediators are not supposed to come forward with their own plans. That is not what mediators are about. The United States has pretended to act as a mediator in the Arab-Israeli conflict. It's repeatedly coming up with its own ideas and its own plans, ideas which most people would agree have been tilted very, very favorably towards the Israelis. And this has been one of the prime reasons in my opinion, why all of those supposed mediation attempts by the United States have never succeeded in achieving peace in the Middle East. Because the United States, far from acting as a mediator, has instead purported to sought to impose on the conflicting parties its own ideas. A mediator does not come with ideas. A mediator speaks to each side and conveys to each side the views and opinions of the other. And the mediator gradually, and it's a complex and time-consuming and often very thankless task, manages to get the two sides to speak with each other, usually in mediation. There is no direct contact between the opposing sides, at least at the beginning. Anyway, gradually the mediator is able to isolate what the points of conflict between the two sides are. Also, the points where they actually agree. Gradually, a dialogue between the conflicting parties through the mediator takes place, and then the mediator is eventually able to bring them together into face-to-face discussions, and then out of those discussions, possibly, in fact, in my experience, more often than not, an agreement is eventually found. Something like that was done in the first weeks of the war, with the Israelis and the Belarusians and the Turks acting as mediators, and the result was the abortive peace that was almost agreed in Istanbul. It's possible that we might see something like that again, though it'll be much, much more difficult to achieve this time. I have to say, given the kind of angry words that are coming out of Kiev at the moment, I think the Ukrainians, for the moment, are very, very unwilling to engage in any sort of diplomatic discussions at all, even via negotiations, even via mediation. That they're basically digging in and refusing to budge from their existing positions. As to the Russians, well, Lavrov has now spoken out about this. He says, and he's now specifically talking about the positions of Western countries, consist of ignoring Russia's positions and demanding Russia's capitulation. Of course, when he talks about Western countries, he also means the Ukrainians. Everyone ignores what we're saying and continues to call on us to show a constructive approach. And in fact, in their understanding, that now means capitulation. There will be no such thing. All the goals of the special military operation will be achieved. There is no doubt about that. The Russian side has stated its position 1,000 times. President Putin has repeatedly said, responding to annoying appeals, that Zelensky has forbidden himself and all his employees to negotiate with Russia by his decree signed 2 years ago. Our president said, at least so that you Westerners have some arguments to reproach us for not wanting to negotiate, let him cancel publicly this very decree of his. Nothing is happening. So the Russians are saying, well, we're ready, we're willing to negotiate, we're willing to engage in negotiations. If the Indians want to act as mediators, we're certainly not going to say no. The Chinese want to do the same, we're not saying no. But for the moment, the Ukrainians are not moving. They're saying they want to talk, but they're not taking any steps at all which would lead us to think that they're at all serious about it. And in the meantime, we will continue doing what we are doing, and in any event, at some point, one way or the other, the goals of the special military operation outlined by Putin way back in February 2022 will be achieved and will be achieved in full. Well, we will see where all this goes, but we are in a very, very strange situation in this conflict where the Ukrainians, as I said, want help. They want the war to end. I think they've gradually come to understand that they're not going to get any help from the West that will really turn things round. They understand that Western supplies of shells and missiles are not going to be anywhere near enough, but they're still digging in and they're refusing to talk on anything other than their own proposals, which are, as Lavrov says, a demand for Russia's capitulation, which makes absolutely no sense at all, given that the Russians are actually winning. And when this fact is pointed out to them by the Chinese, by the Vatican, soon, I suspect, by the Indians, they simply stop their ears and refuse to listen. And of course, by Orban as well. Anyway, there we go. I'm going to make one observation. This is Ukraine's last chance. If over the next few weeks, and I think this is Ukraine's last window of opportunity to negotiate an end to this war, to achieve a peaceful negotiation, a peaceful conclusion to this war. If the Ukrainians refuse to do that, at any point, despite all of these efforts by the Vatican, by the Chinese, by the Indians, by the Brazilians as well, by the way, by all of these countries, if they refuse to listen and dig their heels in and continue to insist that the only basis for negotiations is their maximalist goals, then with the direction of events happening on the battlefronts, they will conclusively lose the war. And then the question will no longer be what negotiation can take place between the Ukrainians and the Russians, but how the Russians resolve the strategic dilemma that they will face, which Eve Smith discussed recently in an article in Naked Capitalism. If the Russians win the war, but the Western powers and the Ukrainians continue to dig in their heels, and the Ukrainians maybe go away and establish a government in exile, and the Western powers continue to reject whatever outcome there has been in the war, and the situation remains diplomatically deadlocked, with the Russians in control of far bigger areas of Ukraine, far greater territories, and much larger populations than they had anticipated when the special military operation began. But to repeat again, the Russians will have dilemmas to face in that scenario. But it's important to understand that they are not going to compromise on their essential conditions. Lavrov has again said this. If the Ukrainians will not compromise, the Russians have made it clear that they will press forward and face those dilemmas when they eventually come. For the Russians, by this point in the war, by this point in the Ukrainian conflict, that is a lesser price facing those dilemmas, then agreeing to another unsatisfactory peace, like the ones previously agreed in Minsk, Minsk I and Minsk II, and also Istanbul, which leave the underlying conflict unresolved. So there it is. The Ukrainians only have a limited time window. I don't know whether they understand this. I don't know whether this fact is being pointed out to them. Of course, it could also be the case that when the Americans, if there is a change of administration in the United States, that the new administration, when it takes office in January, will also have its own thoughts to bring. I can't predict about that, but all I would say is that, in my opinion, at the most generous, the Ukrainians perhaps have up to the end of this year to start negotiations in earnest, perhaps using India as a mediator. Perhaps it won't, the time window isn't even that long. Beyond that, we will be in a Germany 1945 scenario. It will be total defeat and capitulation and nothing else. Anyway, there we are. So let's press on. Now, yesterday, the Russian central bank took the completely correct decision to increase interest rates from 16% to 18%. A major jump, though it's important to say that though it is a jump, the central bank, if you raise interest rates from 16% to 18%, well, it's not quite as dramatic a jump than it would be if you raise interest rates from, say, 7% to 9%, because by this point, interest rates are already very high and very elevated. Now, the central bank has provided a detailed explanation as to why this has happened, and basically the reason is that the Russian economy is firing ahead on all cylinders. It is growing much faster than the central bank anticipated, and as many people have talked about, there is now significant overheating in the economy. Now, I am going to say something here which I think goes against most Western commentary about this, because I think that there is a major misunderstanding about what has happened or what is happening based on claims which I've been seeing in an article, for example, in the Financial Times, posted, by the way, before the central bank made this interest rate decision, but articles and commentaries that I said in many places, that the reason that the central bank is raising interest rates, is being forced to raise interest rates, and the reason why there is higher inflation in Russia than the central bank wants, and inflation in July, early part of July, reached 9% on an annualized basis, though it has started to fall back. The reason I think most people assume that this has happened is because of supposedly out of control government spending in Russia. In other words, that this is due to fiscal expansion on the part of the Russian government to fund the war. Now, one of the fascinating things about this is that people say this even though it is not what the central bank, the Russian central bank itself is saying. And I say this just because we've had lengthy discussion from the central bank about what is causing inflation to spike in Russia. And there's also been a discussion of all of this from Nabulina herself. She gave a press conference, very interesting press conference. And the most interesting thing about it was that, yes, she did talk very little about fiscal expansion, but mostly she made it absolutely clear that the problems were monetary. They were on the monetary side. Now, briefly, what happened, if we go back, is that in 2022, after the sanctions were imposed, the central bank doubled interest rates, increased interest rates from around 10% to 20% to stabilize the situation and to support the ruble and to prevent an inflationary crisis getting out of control. This did indeed stabilize the situation. The economy, the Russian economy, did not implode. There was a dip in output and production, but from about the last quarter of 2022, a revival began to take place and the economy began to recover, including there started to be a significant recovery in output. Now, despite the fact that the economy was starting to recover, Nabulina herself, the central bank in other words, which began to cut interest rates in the summer of 2022, went on doing so right through 2022 and into the early part of 2023. And interest rates fell to around 7.5%, which was, by Russian standards, very low in real terms. And as Nabulina has herself admitted, as the central bank has herself admitted, not in these last comments, but earlier, the central bank cut interest rates too far and held them low for too long, despite the fact that all of the indicators within the economy pointed to a recovery starting to take shape. And in June 2023, it all came together. The low interest rates, the fiscal expansion, the recovery in investment, the recovery in spending, all came together, and suddenly we had a surge. And that surge has continued ever since. And it means that the Russian economy in 2023, well, officially it's supposed to have achieved GDP growth of around 3.6%. I've seen some suggestions that growth was probably closer to 4%, perhaps something even higher than 4%. We are still dealing with numbers which have not yet been completely assessed. And that expansion has continued. And by the way, the central bank has now revised upwards its predictions for overall economic growth by the Russian economy this year. It's growing. The central bank now expects growth in Russia this year to be around 3.5% to 4% in terms of GDP. And as I've discussed in many programs, there's been a huge investment surge, in factories, principally in manufacturing production. There's been a very significant increase in output by the manufacturing side of the economy. And this is what is driving the growth in the economy. Now, all of this is happening, of course, against a backdrop of increases in real wages. And a lot of the discussion has been about the fact that real wages in Russia have been growing and growing significantly during the period of the special military operation. What I think is not appreciated, and something which, by the way, has been clarified in, surprisingly enough, the article that I mentioned in the Financial Times, is that we now have an overall view of what has happened with what has been happening with real wages in Russia over the last decade. So, 2014, at the start of the Ukrainian conflict, when the West first imposed sectoral sanctions on Russia, there was, as I well remember, a significant inflation spike and real wages fell. Real wages fell by around 1% in 2014. And they continued to fall in 2015 and 2016, and the last year of contraction in terms of real wages was 2017. The worst year was 2016, when real wages fell and were around 5% below their level in 2013. So a steep fall in real wages. Now, what the Financial Times does not say is that the reason why real wages fell during this period was because throughout it, right up until 2017, Nabulina and the central bank were imposing extremely tight monetary conditions on the Russian economy. And these stifled growth. There was overall GDP growth throughout this period, but it was much lower than it would have been were interest rates not as high as they were. I know all about this because I was commenting about the fact extensively at the time. I was pointing out that interest rates at that time, interest rates above inflation throughout this period, stood at around 5%, which is exceptionally high interest rates for any economy, and inevitably, with the cost of interest costs in Russia being so high, that was having a major depressive effect on the economy. And of course, Nabulina's explanation, her justification for doing this, was that she needed to bring down inflation, which in 2015 peaked at around, as I remember, 11 or 12%. And she did bring down inflation. In fact, she brought down inflation far below her own target. Her target was 4%, an annualized rate of inflation of 4%. She'd calculated, the central bank had calculated that Russia needed 4% inflation in order to be able to develop its economy better. It was still, in some respects, a developing economy, a economy that needed to expand production, that needed relatively cheap credit and relatively cheap money, and that meant a higher rate of inflation than one would be looking for in a more developed and mature economy like the ones in the West. So she calculated that the optimal level of inflation in Russia, for Russia, at this stage of its development cycle, is 4%. And in fact, because of her monetary overkill in the period between 2014 and 2017, inflation in Russia actually fell to 2%. And there was criticism of this. People were pointing out quite correctly that she was going well beyond her own monetary targets, that she was engaging in monetary overkill, and as a result was suffocating the economy. And the fact that inflation had fallen to just 2% as opposed to 4%, far from being a sign of success, was rather a proof of the extent of her own monetary overkill. Anyway, after that, in 2017, Nabulina and the central bank started to relax monetary policy, and growth in the economy started to return, and real wages started to rise. And they have risen consistently ever since. So in 2018, real wages rose by just under 1%. In 2019, they rose by 2%. In 2019, they rose by about 1%. In 2020, this is, of course, a pandemic year, but Russia never imposed the kind of lockdown that was widespread in the West. In 2020, real wages rose by around 2%. They rose by more than 3% in 2021, and they've continued to rise since then. In 2023, real wages rose by just under 6%. So the rise in real wages preceded the period of the special military operation. In fact, if you look at a graph, you can see a sort of steady increase in real wages since then. In 2024, by the way, real wages are likely to go on rising, but at a slightly slower rate than in 2023. So it's not fiscal expansion that is causing changes in the Russian economy. It is monetary policy. It is the fact that interest rates were too high for the period before 2018. They then were relaxed significantly in the period between 2018 and 2022, resulting in higher growth in the economy during that period and an increase in living standards. Then from 2022 to 2024, from 2022 to 2023, they went very low by historic levels. And the result was, given all the suppressed demand that has existed in Russia, going back all the way to 2014, you've had a surge. There's been this massive investment surge. And if you read Nabulina's explanations of her latest interest rate increase, she acknowledges this. She says that people are borrowing at far faster rates than she imagined, that there is a huge increase in consumer credit, that moreover, her own previous statements to the effect that interest rates might again be cut this year spurred people to take out more loans even as interest rates actually rose. And so the result is that she's now having to cut back, to try to put the pressure cooker back on by raising interest rates once more. Inflation in Russia, more than anything else, is a monetary phenomenon. Now, this has been spoken about by Milton Friedman. He claimed that inflation is always a monetary phenomenon, but it has been historically so in recent years in Russia, both when inflation has gone too low, when it's fallen to 2%, and when it's gone too high, as we have seen now. It has not been a result of growth in real wages, as many people think, or of growth in spending, government spending. Government spending has perhaps increased by around 20% since the start of the special military operation, but it has been balanced. The federal budget deficit is around 0.5% of GDP as it stands, and the government is gradually increasing or moving towards a restructuring of the tax system to create a more progressive tax system, something it has been talking about doing for at least 10 years, by the way, and which it is now able to do because the external environment, the sanctions, in other words, preclude capital flight. One of the reasons, by the way, why people assume that Russia is a gas station rather than an economy is because oil and gas receipts have formed a disproportionate part of government budget revenue. They're not as high as many people think. This has been, the real reason this has been the case is because the government has been reluctant to tax other parts of the economy because of its fears of capital flight. Now that those fears have gone, it is able to move towards a more balanced taxation structure. Anyway, it's not a fiscal surge, and it's not even a surge in a rise in real incomes. Real incomes have been rising steadily in Russia since 2018. Real wages have grown since the start of the special military operation by around 14%. But consumption of goods and services, this is according to the Financial Times, has increased by around 25%. It is this extra 10% which is accounted for by borrowing, consumer borrowing, which is financed by this cheap credit which Nabulina herself has made possible. And it is this surge in consumer credit which she's now trying to cool down. And I think she will. In fact, I predict that once again, what we're going to see is that Nabulina is going to exceed her targets. She's talking about 4.5% inflation by the end of next year. If she continues along her present course, she will surpass that. We could easily end up with an inflation rate which is below the 4% target all over again. Anyway, my key point here is that if we understand that these inflation issues are primarily related to interest rate movements, and as I said, I have history about this. My original work as somebody who commented about Russia was principally as an economic commentator discussing the economic policies of the Russian government, and in particular the interest rate policies of the Russian central bank. If we understand that, we can understand something further, that this overheating that is taking place is likely to prove a temporary phenomenon. The danger is not that Russia is going to run out of money. There is a huge surplus of it in Russia now. Nor is it that the Russian industrial economy is going to crash or anything like this, or that the government is going to run out of money, or that it won't be able to conduct its foreign trade, or anything of that kind. It is that Nabulina will again do that which she did in 2014, which is keep interest rates too high for too long. She is blaming herself correctly for keeping interest rates too low for too long in 2023. And she's right. It would be, in my opinion, an equally big mistake if this time she overcompensates. Anyway, this is a rather nerdish discussion about economic matters. I know some people, their sort of eyes glaze over when these sort of things are talked about. Suffice to say, inflation in Russia has probably peaked now, and in fact, over the last couple of weeks, it's actually started to fall. The economics ministry has backed Nabulina's decision to raise interest rates, and I think everyone in Russia agrees that this is the correct thing to do at this time. As Nabulina correctly said, the market was itself basically signaling that a rise in interest rates was needed. Bank interest rates on bank deposits were already rising before the central bank took this decision, and yields on OFZs, Russian bonds, were also growing as well. So it was a correct decision for the central bank to make. It will rebalance the economy. It will, as I said, eliminate the overheating. But as I said, it is not an overheating caused by excessive spending by the government, as some people think, but as I said, by Nabulina's own decision to keep interest rates too low for too long. Now, one point that Nabulina does make, and by the way, just to reiterate again, she does not say that overspending by the government is the source of the problem. Just to repeat that again. But she does identify what I suspect is the major structural problem which the Russian economy faces going forward, which is that Russia's population, there are just not enough workers. There is now reduced employment. Unemployment in Russia is at 2.6%. There's no great reserve army of workers that can be brought in. This is limiting scope for expansion. Companies want to increase output. They can invest in new equipment and machinery, and that's what they're doing. But doing that takes time, as she correctly says, and eventually these investments will bear fruit. But demand surging on the back of all of these soft monetary conditions is growing much too quickly for even the rapidly expanding industrial sector to keep up with this degree of demand. And of course, the way to deal with this is one of two ways. Either you increase imports, which I think the Russian government is very unwilling to do for lots of reasons, or you have to find more workers. Now, the economics ministry has said that they do think that Russia will be able to find more workers. The economics ministry, Reshetnikov, has made this observation. He says that even as he says that he supports the interest rate increase, he says, we believe that potential economic growth is higher than the estimates of the Bank of Russia. Despite labour market restrictions, it shows there is quite a lot of flexibility. We are currently preparing initiatives together with the Ministry of Labour based on business proposals, discussing issues of increasing the flexibility of labour relations. We assume that the reserves for labour productivity growth in the economy are quite large. Well, all of that is true, and I'm sure that the economics ministry is right. Maybe, as they say, there is scope for increasing the rate of productivity growth in Russia, and Nabulina's comment about investment making productivity higher over time is also true. But I cannot help myself but think that sooner or later, if this level of expansion that Russia is undertaking is going to be sustained, that the Russians are going to have to make a decision to import labour. And of course, one can do that through outright immigration, as happens in Britain and the United States and other places, or one can turn instead to the mechanism that was used in Germany during the 50s and 60s, importing guest workers. Who's to say? But I think sooner or later the Russians are just going to have to accept this. They may do other things. They no doubt will. They will no doubt create conditions to encourage families to have children. But even that, realistically, is only going to affect the labour force, the state of the labour force in 20 years. And in order to persuade people to have children, you anyway need to provide steady economic growth and improvements in living standards in order to encourage them. So I think one way or the other, if this major bottleneck is going to be overcome, yes, no doubt, they can do some things to improve productivity in the short term, but they will at some point have to grasp the nettle of importing workers from North Korea, from Iran, from Central Asia, from Ukraine. Who knows from where, but that's, I think, sooner or later, what they're going to have to do. Anyway, this is where I finish my program today. There's an awful lot more that can be said about this. I've not quoted directly from Nabulina's and the central bank's statements because, well, these videos already have a tendency to go on for very long. But if you want to get a sense of what I mean, the central bank, the Russian central bank, has its website. You can find all of the comments there translated into English, and there's an explanation of why the central bank has done what it has done, and you can see that they're talking essentially about a monetary phenomenon. Anyway, there we are. That's where I finish my program today. More from me soon. Let me remind you again that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar. Don't forget to check out our shop where you can find all the amazing things that we have. Hats, hoodies, t-shirts, sweatshirts, magic mugs, all those things. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.